to episode 2 of Gender Heretics, and I am Nix, and we have all been AWOL for like 4 months. We did the first episode, which was way too long, and we had planned to do an episode every week, and it immediately fell apart because our lives immediately fell apart, and I had ongoing technical difficulties, and in a nutshell, just could not deal with this shit. But we plan to get this up and running again in 2020. So this is our first episode of 2020. And I am here with Hag.
Hello.
Say hi.
Hello.
So Hag is another admin of another Facebook page that gets very political. She runs art history memes for radical feminist dreams. Did I get it right?
You got it correct.
Woo. Okay. Hag also is someone who previously identified as trans and no longer does. So she has a similar story to mine. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, Hag?
Okay. Well, it started when I was 14 and I began cross-dressing. I just wanted to try drag because I'd always been interested in like special effects makeup. And all of a sudden, wow, looking male and being perceived as male just feels so much better. I wonder why.
Right.
And that just spiraled into, well, I was on Tumblr because I was at just the right age for the beginning of the whole trans wave on Tumblr. And I started going, is this me? This might be me. This sounds a lot like me because I was a bit of a tomboy growing up. And then came the rapid onset gender dysphoria. And then I started to identify as male. And it wasn't until I started getting really into radical feminism that I realized that the dysphoria wasn't really there anymore, and when it did come, I was able to cope with it in much healthier ways rather than just dissociating and being like, no, I'm a boy. Not to say that the feeling doesn't come up once in a while, but it does, but that's a very short version of, 7-8 years of my life.
Yeah. So from what I understand, you had never medically transitioned, but you socially transitioned?
Yes, I was always very afraid of medical transition because I was aware. Even when I was like in the thick of it, I was always very aware that there was the possibility of it being a temporary thing. And I was very fortunate because the therapists and the doctors that I had, because I came right before the pro-trans wave, were all very critical, not like of me, but they had very strong critical thinking, and I think that they were able to see that my issues that the root of my issues did not lie in my gender dysphoria, but rather other mental health stuff that was going on that just so happened to manifest as gender dysphoria.
Okay. And have you sort of publicly detransitioned socially? Are you now no longer known as trans by anyone in real life, or
I publicly detransitioned and I went back to she, her, and my birth name about a month ago now. And that's been fun. Been losing a couple Facebook friends here and there over it.
Oh.
But it feels, I never thought I'd be back in a place where I could go by my old name again. And the fact that I am, it's like, feels very liberating. It feels a lot better. And actually, surprisingly enough, some of the biggest pushback, if you can even call it that, has been from my mother, not because she's unhappy with me detransitioning, but because she spent like 8 years trying to get my new name right, and now I'm like, hi, birth name again. She's like, great, you're confusing me.
Well, that's at least understandable, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you? What were your feelings about switching everything back? What were your concern? Like, did you have any concerns about it? Was there any hesitation?
Well,
I mean,
in
I
all
know the
honest-
answer to this, but I'd like you to tell the people listening.
in all honesty, my biggest concern was actually the social fallout from the more radiqueer social circles that I run in, because I come from, I'm not going to out where I'm from, but it's very liberal. It's very lefty out where I am.
Yeah.
And so the pro-trans ideology is the mainstream. And so, especially since I post a lot of like blatantly radical feminist things on Facebook and on my other social media, I was a little concerned that I'd get labeled with, the T word.
Yes, the dreaded T word. Which, as it turns out, once you've been firmly established to be the T word kind of stops bothering you so much, right?
It's more like a fun thing I call myself now. I'm just like, oh, turfy turf McTurf face.
Yep. Yeah, same. So,
but
we obviously have similar backgrounds. I also never medically transitioned, and there's some other commonalities there as well. Like I have a history of mental illness and eating disorders.
As do I.
Yep. And something that we have talked about that we thought that we might chat a little bit about today on Gender Heretics is the need for control that we have observed in ourselves when we were identifying as trans, and also just personally I observed this in other people as well, and how that relates to the pronouns thing and just the ideology in general. So it seems to be really a very useful ideology for people who feel a lack of control over their lives, over themselves and their emotions. And it gives you a framework for being able to feel like you have more control, because you can focus on those things. You can focus on the things like the pronouns, and you can kind of wait for people to screw up and then be able to flex your muscles a little bit and actually feel like you're in control. And this is something that's quite similar to some of the stuff that underlies eating disorders as well. Is that also your experience?
Oh, most definitely. So a little bit more background that's not intrinsically tied to the trans identity thing is that I had up until I was 19 years old, I had an undiagnosed learning disability. So even though I was really smart and my teachers liked me very much, I was always having issues in school. And so this really, it kind of damaged my self-worth, and kind of my self-image was like very low. It was like a lot of self-loathing, and this ability to kind of reclaim it and be like, well, this is my problem. This is my issue. And it gave me a sense of like, oh, I'm in control of the narrative.
Yeah.
Whereas my whole life was all over the place because of these underlying issues that weren't being dealt with. But I was like, no. I'm fine. My big issue is that I'm the trans. I am a troon. And that's where all my problems ultimately lie. Or at least that was the delusion I was functioning on, because it's much easier to kind of place the blame on this one very concrete thing versus trying to tackle the minutia and chaos that is objectively real life.
Oh, absolutely. And that's pretty much what was going on for me with my disordered eating as a teen. I'm long since recovered from that, but that was definitely a part of the motivation there as well, was being able to just, yeah, regard all of these very complex issues, and like scale them down and simplify them to being about my body and my weight, and then being able to feel like I was in a better position to be able to have some control over that as well. And then I feel like I really did redirect that into the sex dysphoria thing. You mentioned something before about having thought that you might have been trans and then having the sudden onset of dysphoria rather than the other way around.
So for me, it was I remember I remember a very specific moment where things kind of changed for me. I was in physical education, and that day I had been binding. Now, I was a bit of an early bloomer. I started developing breasts around 9 or 10, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. Um, so once I learned about binding, I started to bind a lot, and it felt very relieving. And so I would sometimes come to school wrapped in an ace bandage, because this was still before teenagers just got binders like it was no big deal.
Yeah.
And so I was at school and I was binding, and we were playing soccer, and for some reason, and at this point I didn't consider myself trans. I dabbled with the possibility of maybe, like, well, why am I so comfortable being perceived as male? So of course it crossed my mind. But then I had this image of myself like, well, what if I got top surgery? And I was like, wait, what the fuck? It felt like an epiphany almost, but it was also quite distressing.
Yeah.
Because again, I was very aware of the transient nature of, well, even just one's personality, I suppose. And so, yeah, I was well, I don't know if in denial is the right word, but at the time I considered it, kind of felt like I was in denial of like what I actually wanted, when in reality it was more just my brain being like, no, this is something to have valid hesitations about, because this is a big decision. But so yeah, I actually did consider, I did think about things like surgery before the dysphoria became really intense, so to speak.
Yeah, see, that's something that um, stands out to me, because things have changed over the last 10 years or so. I first started identifying, I mean, I didn't even have this language at the time. I obviously had seen transsexuals in movies and things like that, but I didn't at the time actually relate that to myself at all, because I'd only ever seen trans women, and the idea of being a transsexual female was unheard of to me. So I wasn't calling myself trans at the time because I didn't have that language, but that's what was going on, where I was like, I think I'm actually a guy. And that first started happening for me about 12 years ago now. And in my case, the discomfort with my sex, I don't really like to call it gender dysphoria, because it was sex dysphoria. It was about my sexed body. That came first for me, but I feel it got worse. It got worse when I decided to like pursue the trans identity and to commit to that, and to, you know, try and socially transition. I was thinking about it a lot more, like I was dwelling on it a lot more. And I have noticed this in other people as well, where they are there's no outward signs whatsoever of this dysphoria or discomfort with their sex or anything, at all. And then they start identifying as trans, and that's when the dysphoria and all of the associated depression and anxiety seems to
Come in.
yeah. And I've examples of this, I've particularly among people who are biologically female. That's where I see this happening. I've come across young female people who, again, no outward evidence of this sex dysphoria. I'm not saying it's not there. It's just that I don't see any evidence of it. Like, there's no signs that that's what's going on. And then they announce that they are now trans, whether they be trans men or non-binary or anything else. And then after that, it suddenly becomes a really big public issue where they're talking about how if they get referred to using the wrong pronouns, like they're suicidal. And it occurs to me that that's exactly what you would expect if someone is taking pre-existing emotional turmoil and legitimate problems. I'm not delegitimizing the problems that people have. These things are real. But if they're taking those and they're sort of channeling them all into one thing, because I saw that in myself with the eating disordered behavior, and that seems to be what I think I'm seeing in some other people as well. And to me, it sort of makes sense if you decide that hearing the word spoon is a source of your problems, and you decide, I don't ever want to hear the word spoon again, and I'm going to actively try to avoid hearing the word spoon, you will actually start to have quite an intense emotional response when you're unable to avoid hearing the word spoon, when you're not in control. When you decide you want to control something and you're invested
that is ultimately uncontrollable.
Yeah, and that's the other side of it as well, is that this stuff really does rely on other people acting a certain way, and of course you're not going to be able to control that. So it's almost, it kind of makes sense that there are people for who this distress over their sex comes after the trans identity rather than before.
And I feel like I do have to wonder, especially because, as you mentioned, for the longest time, when you saw trans people, transsexuals, transvestites, whether that be in movies or other forms of media, it used to be the majority of those people were male to female. And now you see this, now the vast majority of trans-identified people, at least as far as I have observed, are these very young female people. I do have to wonder, like, I am of the suspicions that basically the majority of female people will experience some form of dysphoria in their lives to some extent. It's not necessarily quote unquote gender dysphoria or even sex dysphoria, but I do feel like there are lots of things that exist within our culture, at least, that do kind of lead a lot of female people to want to separate.
Oh, your audio is cutting out. Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry, go on.
I'm just having a little bit of trouble articulating what I'm trying to say. So I feel like that this big flood of trans-identified female people may have to do with the fact that from a very young age, we are aware of our own femaleness and the role that plays in society and the vulnerability of femaleness, so to speak. And I do have to wonder if this uptick in trans-identified females has to do with a desire to not be perceived that way, to not be subject to the interpretation of others, especially considering the vast majority of the observation that we will experience as young female people will be through the lens of, male sexualization, starting from a really young age, which is, who knows, that could have been why I was so terrified of the fact I was growing breasts.
Yeah, well, I think that given what we know as people who are female and grew up female and went through female puberty, and just what we know about the stuff that girls and women tend to go through in general, I don't think it's very the idea that it has nothing to do with this sudden massive increase in dysphoria among... That's okay, we'll skip over that. This massive increase in female people who have this horrible dysphoria, I don't think it's plausible to say that this stuff has nothing to do with that. I remember being so uncomfortable when I started to grow breasts, and I also developed really early. I also got my first period really early, and I was really, really humiliated to have these things on my chest. It made me very, very self-conscious, and I was very aware of being sexualized, and the disordered eating was very much linked, and the desire to obviously be really, really thin and to get rid of my body fat was very much linked to wanting to be de-sexed in a way. I was uncomfortable with having this sexed body. And at the time, the outlet that was available to me was this eating disorder. And then the trans thing happened, and then that was just an extension of the same thing. And most of the women that I know will tell you similar stories about feeling uncomfortable with their bodies, and obviously being very aware of being sexualized by boys and even adult men. And I just don't think that it is actually remotely realistic to think that that doesn't have at least something to do with this huge increase in gender dysphoria in female children.
It's interesting because I think one of the big things that sort of so I don't have a lot of memories from my childhood. I've successfully blocked a lot of that out, but I do remember experiencing, for lack of a better, feeling like I was experiencing the ire of men and boys because I was female, but I was not socially acceptably female because I always had short hair. Once I started growing body hair, I didn't really like shaving. And so I felt in a way very desexualized, but it wasn't on my own term. It was like, oh, you're disgusting because you don't match these certain criteria. And so the fact that when I kind of transitioned, I was able to have body hair and short hair, and still kind of fit this, like, this very quote unquote, like, kind of twinkie ideal of, like, attractiveness. I feel like that sort of played a role too, if that makes some sense. Because I was so used to being disgusting to people.
Yeah, that's really relatable. And I would suggest that also that's compounded when you are same-sex attracted as well. We are both bisexual. I don't know if you felt that was related, but it certainly was for me. Not only did I feel like I was... disgusting is the right word, actually. That's exactly how I felt. I felt very disgusting. I found my body disgusting. I had an idea of, what a correct woman or girl was. And I absolutely fell short of that standard in every possible way. I was tall. I was too tall. I was too fat. I was I wasn't delicate enough, and then on top of that, I was attracted to girls, which made me feel even more disgusting. And I was raised in a very, very progressive household. I didn't grow up surrounded by homophobia or anything. My mother was someone who was really supportive when I came out. But I guess that cultural messaging was just so strong that it still managed to get to me. So I already felt disgusting about myself being a failed female. But then on top of that, I was also doing female wrong by being attracted to other girls. And also, I felt especially disgusting when I found myself attracted to the kind of girls who did meet those standards of femininity. Like that was something that I shouldn't be doing. Like as if I was coveting something simply because I couldn't be it. I still haven't worked through that stuff. Is any of that relatable to you?
That's definitely relatable, and I do like, and I'm still, I also came from a pretty progressive family. My father's best friend, like his best friend in the whole world, is a gay man, and my father's always been very open about that. He used to live in San Francisco, actually during the AIDS crisis.
Oh wow.
So this stuff wasn't entirely foreign to me. But the first sexual feelings I ever felt were same-sex attraction.
Mm.
And it was actually through classical art mostly. I remember the first time I saw a picture of the birth of Venus. That for me is the impetus of my sexual awakening. And I was quite young at the time, but I knew I liked Venus.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so I was in the second grade, and I would draw her, and I would get so excited by the fact that she had these curves and these breasts and this long, beautiful hair that, like, implied that certain parts of her exist while hiding them.
I mean, this is
But
kind of crazy to me because same, except for me, it was Renoir's Bathing Beauties, and I also would draw these naked women and then feel very ashamed of myself for it.
that I felt so much shame. I felt so much shame towards this idea that I was so fascinated by the female form. And
Yeah.
so, even though I grew up in this progressive household, I guess I really internalized a lot of homophobia just because I grew up in the United States in the early 2000s. And there was a point where there wasn't even a dialogue regarding gay rights in the mainstream. Like, kids today in elementary school, they know what gay people are. I didn't for a long time. Like, I didn't even know that was an option. I just had all these weird feelings that I couldn't really do anything with. And as I internalized that, I also was internalizing this idea of what a woman should be like. And so I'm still unpacking it to this day, not only my attraction to women, but also my relationship to women who do perform femininity, because I am attracted to them. And there's a part of me that also envies them, because I know there's a part of me that knows if I could just be more like them, I would have been treated better in my past. I would be treated better now.
Yes.
Because, and so, like, I think, and body hair is a really big part of it for me, because I haven't shaved in years now, and I'm more than happy with it. I look at myself and I'm like, yes, I am an adult human female. These are my secondary sex characteristics. These are the things that make me a woman, But I still have this confusion, especially when I'm attracted to gender conforming women. It's like, how much of this is envy? How much of this is genuine attraction? And I feel like a lot of it is genuine attraction, but I've internalized so much misogyny that I'm still trying to undo, that it becomes very complicated. And, like, there's a mixture of, well, I love women, but I hate myself. And the dichotomy becomes really obvious when I am attracted to women, because there are more gender conforming women than there are gender non-conforming women.
True. Yeah, there's I don't think that it's necessarily all internalized homophobia, but internalized homophobia was definitely a part of that picture for me.
And I do kind of wonder if now obviously I'm not a lesbian, uh so I can't be butch per se. But I do kind of wonder sometimes if my interest in cross dressing, in binding, and appearing more masculine was a desire to be able to kind of fit that quote unquote butch role.
Okay.
Because it would allow, like, because if I was, let's say I was a female exclusive bisexual, and like, um, I was quote unquote more butch, uh, that would be to some extent, that feels more acceptable to me than being in the middle where I am both gender nonconforming and still experience heterosexual attraction, because it puts me in this very strange, very uncomfortable place, because I do desire men and desire I do desire male desire, but I understand the way I express myself and the way I function as a woman is kind of abhorrent to many men.
Yeah, that's a really pleasant truth. Um, I sort of, I always felt really, I felt like an abomination when I would try to perform femininity. Um, and I don't think objectively I ever looked out of place, but I felt totally out of place. I felt like I was just a giant lumbering spectacle whenever I would try to be feminine. Um, and when I would present in a more masculine way, I felt that actually made me feel even deeper shame um, over my attraction to women. And then, of course, there's that thing about men as well, because I am bisexual. I am attracted to very few men, but it is real. So definitely bisexual. And yeah, generally, most men are not really into very masculine women. And there are men that are into very masculine women, and there are very feminine men who are into very masculine women, but that's not really a thing that seems to exist in our like sort of cultural consciousness. Like I can't point, apart from some people that we know personally, I can't point to any examples of feminine male people who are exclusively interested in masculine female people. Like, it is a real thing, but it's not something that's visible. Like, you don't actually know that that's a way to have those heterosexual relationships. Never occurred to me that that was possible, that there might be men who would be attracted to masculine women, and or that there were feminine men that I might be attracted to who were still very aware that they were men. That none of that occurred to me at all. So feelings of shame clearly deeply entrenched in this for both of us, which is in and of itself a red flag. Our decision making has been influenced by these things that really warrant further investigation and more unpacking. And I am really, really glad that I didn't seek out medical transition, and that there was no one to just, unquestioningly affirm me in that, because it would have been the wrong decision for me, and it would have had permanent consequences that I would not be happy with now. And it does make me worry about other people, and specifically female people, and specifically young female people, and more specifically young same-sex attracted female people. because this can't just be us, obviously. And we have heard from other people who have previously identified as trans and people who have actually detransitioned after having medically transitioned. And the overwhelming majority of them seem to be same-sex attracted, whether they are lesbian or bisexual. And that's something that really should not be overlooked. That warrants some query. But we don't seem to be able to do that without being labelled, hateful.
Turvy McTurv face.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's extremely frustrating because personally, I do know people who identify as trans and who have medically transitioned who will attest that their quality of life has been drastically improved by medical transition. I don't see any evidence to the contrary, and I wouldn't. I'm happy for them, but at the same time, I also don't want to see more people ending up in the position that some of these detransitioned lesbian, bisexual women have ended up in, because that's not nice for them at all. So I don't really know how to try and bring the political climate around this to a place where we can have those conversations without it being shut down and without the accusations. And I guess that's why we are having these conversations on YouTube right now.
and under false names.
Yes. Now, something else, because this was meant to be a lot shorter than the other one, so probably shouldn't keep this going for too long, but something else that I wanted to comment on and see if this was something that you had noticed as well. This is, like I've said before, things have changed quite a lot in the last 12 years since I started identifying as a man. But this emphasis on pronouns has always been really strange to me, because for me, I wanted to successfully pass as the opposite sex. I wanted people to think that I was male when they looked at me. So I never got upset or angry when people would refer to me as she or her, and I never actually tried to make people say the pronouns, because for me, if someone called me she, then that was telling me that they could see that I was female, and the bad feelings were coming from being seen as female, not from the actual language. The language was just telling me that that was the situation. There was no point in me getting angry at people and correcting them, because that had no value to me. I wanted to successfully pass as being male, and if I wasn't successfully passing as male, then what was the bloody point of having people just performatively use the pronouns? It was meaningless to me. And I remember for a while I was going to my local LGBT youth centre, and they had a weekly event that was just for trans people, and I was going to that, and sometimes there would be people who would refer to me as she or her, and then everyone would just immediately correct them, and they were really vigilant about this as well. And that actually made me really uncomfortable, because I was like, who is this for? Because I'm controlling people's language under threat of being told off has no value to me whatsoever. I don't understand this. They can see that I'm female. That's what I'm sad about. I'm sad about the fact they can see me as female. I'm not sad about the fact that they called me by female pronouns, because that's the obvious thing to do when they can see that I'm female. But fast forward a decade, and there is this huge emphasis on the pronouns themselves. And it's something that I just can't relate to, because... And it looks very much to me, again, like this control thing, that you can kind of take really, really complex issues that you have, and pain that you have, and trauma and depression and anxiety and all of these things, and you can kind of get tunnel vision in a sense and just focus on this one thing, and then feel like you're doing something about it when you correct people. Like
Yeah.
how did that work for you with the pronouns?
So I don't know, because I came in this weird like I was at this weird intermediate state when I started, when my just dysphoria about my body became channeled into this idea of gender dysphoria. So I was like in between these two generations. We have the first, the first gen wherein it's people more like you who are interested in, who are more concerned about, like personally more concerned about passing and appearing to be the desired sex. And the generation right after me is all about, no, if you identify this way, you are this thing, yada yada. So I was in that period right in between them where I get a little bit of both. So I never got like too upset when people would use she her for me, because um for me the pronouns came secondary to the name, because the name was my little means of control. But especially as I got older and my dysphoria waned, but I still identified as male, so to speak.
Yeah.
It was I'm trying to find the right way to phrase this. I did prefer that people used he him for me, but ultimately it was not that big a deal, and I never got mad at people. Like even if I corrected them, it was like still basically a non-issue. And towards the end, I literally just did not give a shit, like at all. But I still, there was an amount, there was kind of dissatisfaction, even if I knew I wasn't appearing as male. Being called he him was very satisfying, and I hate using this word these days. It was very validating.
Yeah.
And so but I think that had more to do with the way I grew up and kind of some of the, and none of my family's home. So, and some of the trauma from my family, is that the language was really important to me at that point, but it was never at the level that you see now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I actually struggle with how to refer to myself. I don't like calling myself detransitioned because I never medically transitioned, and I feel like that makes more sense referring to the people who did, because we are not the same. And I don't like calling myself desisted because actually I still struggle with dysphoria. It doesn't have the hold over me that it used to, and I can absolutely live with it. It's a lot less severe, a lot less consuming, but I still have it, so it actually hasn't desisted. And I don't really want to call myself a re-identified woman because I have no fucking use for this whole identity concept. Like I literally just am a woman, as in my body is female. Like that's how my body is sexed. Like it's not an identity, and I have no use for this idea of like subjective personal identity. So I don't really like that phrasing either. I'm not really sure what to call myself, so sometimes I just say ex-trans.
I was about to say, you could always call yourself an ex-troon.
What a horribly transphobic slur, hag. Awful. Yeah. So I call myself ex-trans, and yeah, I think I'll go with that from now on.
I generally call myself, just to make it simple, I'll say socially detransitioned, because that was as far as my transition ever went. It was social.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because my fashion style hasn't really changed that much between then and now, but I did, in general, like even if I wasn't binding, I did present more androgynously, more masculine leaning, at least by modern standards of femininity.
Yeah.
Which like, and I know we're trying to keep this short, but I just have to bring this up. When I compare the standards of femininity that existed when I was a child versus standards of femininity that exist now, I really am not surprised about the number of young female people who feel like they're not women, because we have the current standard of femininity is this hyper femininity. It's like, to be a woman, you always have to have the like Instagram influencer makeup on fleek, as the young people will say, and you have to have this like perfect Ariana Grande hair. You gotta be that like slim thick, and I can see how triggering that is if you're not any of those things, or if you don't feel comfortable with those things.
Yeah, I mean, not feeling like you have like a natural affinity for those standards of femininity is actually extremely normal and to be expected, because that's a lot. I was just recently thinking about specifically cosmetics and the trends in cosmetics. And when I was in my early teens, it wasn't really the norm for people to worry too much about their eyebrows. Like, I mean, some people would pluck them, and they typically would pluck them really thin, but having like eyebrow kits and a bunch of different products for eyebrows and specific ways of doing them wasn't really a thing. You could go out without having ever touched your eyebrows and still be considered to have a full face of makeup on, and heavy contouring and all of these different things. Like the amount of work involved in performing the feminine ideal today, from my perspective, it's a lot more work, and it seems pretty reasonable to not be interested or to not feel naturally drawn to do that. And that doesn't mean that you're not the sex that you are. It means that you're a person with a personality who has their tastes, and that's okay. Is there anything in particular that you would like to comment on while you're here? Anything at all?
No, I think we turfed it out today.
Yep, I think so. Just like last time, I think we strayed a little bit off topic, but we tend to have a really good online community through Sapphic Sims and some feminist circles and stuff. So we tend to have a lot of these conversations, and I guess on this channel we're just kind of airing them to see if anyone else can benefit from them. So do you reckon that you'll want to come back on, Hag?
Wait, sorry, you cut out for a second.
Oh, do you reckon you'll want to come back on sometime?
Absolutely. This has been a delight.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I guess we will leave it there for today, and probably moving forward, because we obviously disappeared for a really long time, but the plan at the moment is to be doing this again, and ideally keeping it under an hour. And I'm probably personally also going to aim to do some shorter uploads, like 10 or 15 minutes, pretty regularly, just on specific topics, because I do see people struggling with some of the logic that gender ideologues use. And because I used to subscribe to those beliefs, and most of us in our little community did, we can probably shed a little bit of light on what's going on with that logic, and might be helpful for people who are trying to wrap their heads around this stuff. So I'll probably also do some individual little short videos explaining things or clarifying things. And don't forget to check out Hag's Facebook page. What's the
Art
name again?
History Memes for Radical Feminist Dreams. Even I have trouble remembering it.
Yeah, it is delightfully snarky and shitposty. And thank you very much for coming on today. The Gender Heretics...
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. The Gender Heretics Facebook page should be a bit more active now. There's also a Twitter account, which also should be more active now. My page is Sapphic Sims. So there are lots of places that you can reach out if there's anything in particular that you'd like us to comment on, or if there's anyone in particular you'd like us to have on as a guest, or if you just want to give some feedback. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will catch you next time.
Ciao, ciao.